다시 돌아왔습니다. 이제 결전의 시간이 다가오고 있습니다. 특별히 지금 시간에 말씀을 나눌 건 없고요. 조신하게 기다려야 되겠죠? 지금 이 발표하기 전에 항상 이렇게 튀어 올라가죠. 라이언킹님, 하루에 2번. 저는 영상에 지금 막 하루에 4번씩 올리고 있어요. 토니 유차님, LEV가 overnight marketed public offering 후에 엄청 하락했는데 주가가 어떻게 될까요? LEV. 그거는 좀 이따가 봐야 될 것 같아요. 연준 보고. LEV가 뭐 하는 종목인지 모르겠네요. 이 주가 모멘텀은 없어요. 모멘텀은 하락으로 가는 주가래요. 퍼블릭 오퍼링 하면은 퍼블릭 오퍼링 IPO? 저도 정신이 없네, 오늘. 영상이 너무 많아가지고. 이거는 끝났고, 여기에 있으면 되네요. 좀 앞에 문을 좀 바꿨죠? 공사를 좀 했어요. 근데, 공사 그거 다 한다고 또 달라질까요, 사람이? 같은 사람인데, 뭐. 하여튼 감사합니다. 다이안킴님. 피드백 주셔서. 하여튼 키포인트가 3가지 정도일 것 같아요. 이제 연준의 금리 몇 퍼센트 올리느냐, 50 베이시스 포인트, 아니면은 75 베이시스 포인트 올리느냐. 근데 50가 거의 맞는 것 같고, 그리고 두 번째는 얼마나 더 높게 가느냐. 앞으로 다음 연준 회의 때 얼마큼 올리고 또 계속 얼마큼 올리고 올린 후에 얼마나 길게 그 고금리를 유지할 것이냐. 이제 그게 두 가지, 그 다음에 마지막으로는, 인플레이션이 잡힌다, 안 잡힌다, 뭐 그런 얘기를 할 거고, 이제 고용 얘기하면서 임금이 높아지고 있다. 뭐 이제 임금으로 나오는 인플레이션이 세서 인플레이션이 계속 나올 것이다. 뭐 이런 식의, 미국 표현으로는 wet blanket, 젖은 담요를 확 덮어주면은 시장이 훅 죽어버리겠죠. 이제 그것만 좀 피하면 되는데, 일단 같이 잘 지켜보자고요. 지금 여러분들의 의중은 상승으로 했으면 좋겠다. 그렇게 한 70% 정도 보고 계신 것 같아요. 지금 현재 주가 상승이 똑같아요. 나스닥, S&P, 다우 다 0.8% 근처에 상승세를 유지하고 있기 때문에 이게 딱 이제 일단 올려놓은 거예요. 여기다가 진짜로 웻 블랭킷을 덮어줄 건지 아니면은 장작을 지필 것인지 거기에 따라 가지고 주가의 흐름과 방향성이 결정되지 않을까 합니다. 연말인데 연준이 우리 같은 개인 투자자들한테 좀 연말 보너스 한번 줘야 되지 않을까요? 나중에 다시 뺏어가더라도. 이제 긴장되네요. 긴장되는 순간에 축구놈을 보고 있어 내가. 어디를 펴놓고 있어야지 가장 빨리 데이터가 나올까? 일단 요 밑에 있는 CNBC 채널 뉴스가 소리가 안 나는구나. 음,
Application volume finally rose last week.
뉴스 소리 나오죠?
The average rate on the 30-year fixed for conforming loans did increase ever so slightly last week to 6.42% from 6.41 on the MBA survey, but the trajectory for rates has been lower for the past
이제
month.
끌어줬던 애들이 여기서 또
Inflation was cooling and interest rates dropped
일단은
sharply
털어내네요.
after the CPI release. So as a
하여튼
result,
시간만 나면은 단기 수익
loan rose
챙기는데
3%
고사들이야.
previous week. Of course, they're still down 85% from the same week 1 year ago. Still not a ton of people who can benefit given the record low rates we saw during the first 2 years of the pandemic. Now, mortgage applications to buy a home rose 4% for the week, but were 38% lower than the same week 1 year ago. That annual comparison, though, is now shrinking slightly as rates drop. Lower rates have shrunk demand for adjustable rate mortgages. ARMs dropped to 7.7% of total applications last week from just under 13% in October. And we could actually see growth in another type of home loan, home equity loans and lines of credit. TransUnion is forecasting that home equity originations will increase by 24% in 2023 from this year as homeowners tap into about $19 trillion in collective home equity, Kelly.
ELT는 연준 금리랑 반대로 연동이 되는 거잖아요. 그러니까 금리가 내린다 그러면은 프랙션이 내리지 금리는 뭐 몇십 %씩 빵빵 내리는 건 아니죠. 그렇죠? 그리고 TLT는 20년 국채이기 때문에 지금 10년물 국채 움직이는 거랑 비슷하게 움직여요. 그래서 국채가 좀 떨어진다. 그러면은 오를 수 있죠. 하지만 지금 10년물이 3.5% 정도 된단 말이에요. 3.5%에서 3.25가 됐을 때 TLT를 몇 포인트를 수익을 낼 수 있는지를 계산을 해보시고 접근을 하시는 게 좋죠. 그리고 만약에 TLT를 사서 물린다? 그러면은 만약에 그리고 연준이 금리를 오랫동안 한 높은 금리를 유지한다? 그러면은 TLT 주가가 상승하는 속도가 좀 늦겠죠. 그런 역학관계를 다 알고선 접근하시면 되겠죠. Sleep Your Mind님. 닥터 유 껌 에너지님. 닥터 유 에너지 껌님. 오래간만이시네요. 금리 결정되면 바로 롱숏? 한번 오르락 내리락 했다가 방향 정하지 않을까요? 그래 놓고 또 30분 후에 제롬 파웰 스피치가 나온 후에 또 움직일 거고. 제 생각에는 그 언론에 공개되는 기사로만은 긍정적인 소리로 나오지 않을까. 이제 제롬 파웰이 그게 또 걱정이 돼가지고 또 뿅망치로 뿅뿅뿅뿅 하는 기자회견을 하면서 또 내려갈 수도 있고, 그거는 아무도 예측할 수 없죠. 여지까지 한 3-4번 그런 경우가 있었죠. 쑥 올라갔다 쑥 내려갔다. 그렇죠? 방향 위인 줄 알았더니 아래로 가고, 아래인 줄 알았더니 위로 가고. 여러분들이 움직임의 레인지를 정확하게 파악을 하실 수 있다 그러면은 롱숏으로 해놨다가 두 개 다 프로핏을 걸어놓는 거죠. 그럼 적어도 본전은 되지 않을까요? 최악의 경우에. 좀 위험은 해요. 지금 이렇게 변동이 클 수 있는 상황에서 그런 식으로 플레이를 하겠다는 면은, 이럴 때는 뭐 아이언 컨돌 아니면은 스탁으로 하면은 버터플라이 같은 걸로 하든지 뭐. 하여튼 5분 남았습니다. 5분. 긴장. 올해 장은 진짜 어려워요. 어렵다기보다도 익숙치가 않죠. 차라리 마이클 버리처럼, 야, 나는 목에 칼이 들어와도 숏이야. 그리고선 해놓고 있었으면은 돈 엄청 벌었죠. 근데 보통 사람 심리가, 그리고 요번에도 느끼셨겠지만 이게 베어마켓 랠리가 일어나면은 수십 %씩 올라가 버리니까 또 숏을 하면서 편안하게 있을 수도 없고 쉽진 않아요.
Welcome to Power Lunch. I'm Kelly Evans along with Dom Chu. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
It's going to be a quite busy afternoon here.
Is there a Fed decision today?
There is. We are just about 5 minutes away from the
모더나 같은 경우에는 지금 약간 보면은 그 승인을 받아가지고 주가가 좀 많이 올라가고 있죠. 근데 보면은 제약회사들이 중국 때문에 그런지 백신 회사들이 요즘에 또 다시 오르고 있어요. 짜투리 통신이었습니다.
We've got a big Fed panel today. JP Morgan Asset Management's David Kelly, Mona Mahajan with Edward Jones, also John Bellows with Western Asset Management Company, WAMCO as we used to call it back in the day. Thanks everyone for being here as part of this program. Let's start perhaps, Mona Mahajan, with you, with just the expectations that you have from an investment strategy standpoint on whether people need to do anything with their money in the wake of what we're going to get from the Fed today.
Yeah, look, it's a great point. I don't think necessarily we need to move money before or after this Fed meeting, but what we will be watching for, of course, is that dot plot. And really what we're looking for is to see if the markets and the Fed are converging towards the same terminal rate. So right now markets are expecting this 5.25% terminal rate. If the Fed kind of implicitly blesses that level, we see a dot plot that also
50bp는 하나님의 뜻이라고. 50bp는 거의 지금 맞아진 것 같아요.
Get a bit of comfort that we are closer to the end of this Fed tightening cycle, but also perhaps after that we'll get this pause.
제가 아침에 여러분한테 얘기한 게 있어서 잠깐 제가 신뢰를 조금 높이려고 한번 장난을 해봤어요. 한번 이거 보세요. 신뢰가 올라가는지. 이렇게 하면 신뢰가 올라가나요? 쌩얼을 까긴 좀 그렇고 약간 아주 장난을 했어요.
Any volatility in the months ahead will provide that opportunity to position for what we think will be a better market backdrop and potential recovery in 2024.
John, the market right now is pricing in a certain expectation, and we got a little bit of a movement, if you will, in some of those Fed fund futures and the interest rate markets, given what we saw with
이제 갑니다.
softer than expected this past week here, just yesterday. I wonder, do you, in your mind, feel as though the markets are appropriately positioned? In other words, are the expectations correct?
쌩얼을 까긴 좀 그렇고 일단은 그런 것도 있고 나중에 우리 회원들 파리할 때만 조금 지금 상승 간다 생각하시는 분들이 70%, 30%는 하락 간다. 약간 개소리 좀 잡아놓고 갈게요.
Over the summer and through the early fall, they were just reacting. CPI was too high, and they were constantly on their back foot and reacting to those numbers. Reactive policy is problematic. Looking in the rearview mirror is not the best way to do policy, and the Fed is very happy to finally be more forward-looking. And so I think CPI yesterday and also the month before is going to allow them to be more forward-looking in their policy. I think you're going to hear that from Powell today, and I think that's generally a very
개 소리를 좀 차단하고 왔습니다.
CPI yesterday is after today's hike. It'll be the case that the policy rate.
이거 느끼하지 않고 아까 우리 보여드린 거 하나 있는데 아주 다정다감하게 보이는 아주머니 그것도 있는데 엘프도 있고. 오케이 이제 1분 남았습니다. 1분. 떨려. 내가 뭐 이게 결혼하는 날도 아니고 맞선 보는 날도 아니고 왜 이렇게 떨려요? 사실 맞선이라는 건 본 적도 없으면서 이렇게 여기가 있으면 안 되지. 어디를 켜놔야지 빡 뜨나? 이게 바로 뜨나? 심장병 걸리겠네.
We've just got a few moments here left before the decision comes out. You've seen a lot of these decisions before. This year, the numbers suggest that there's been a lot more volatility around Fed rate decisions with the markets. Do you expect that today?
Not really. I think people priced in 50 basis points. I think the dot plot will go up 25 basis points, but still a terminal rate of 4.75 to 5%. I think Jay Powell will actually smile during his press conference because there is better news.
10초 이제.
Opens the window a little wider.
시장의 냄새는 아직 어떻게 나는지 모르겠네요.
Good place here, and I think market expectations and the Fed's view are
2초.
converging here, and I think that's a positive.
이제 장이 한번 내려갔다 올라왔다 할 거예요.
Let's call it ahead of the Fed decision with WTI oil up 2.5%.
Oh, shit. 막 떨어져.
And let's get to Steve Leisman with the Fed decisions.
The Federal Reserve raising interest rates by 50 basis points to a new range of
50
to 4.5% as expected. The Fed saying ongoing rate hikes will be appropriate. The Fed also raising the 2023 median forecast of Fed officials went up to 5.1%. It had been at 4.6%. This is higher than market.
안 좋은데? 느낌에?
Funds rate. It is, by the way, right in line with the Fed survey at 5.15. 17 of the 19 officials are now above 5% in their forecast for the 2023 funds rate. None were above 5 in the September forecast. 7 officials, in fact, are at 5.40, and there's one person who's at 5.63 for all the way through 2025. The funds rate then see going down to 4.1% in 2024.
좀 강하게 나오는데요, 내용이?
25 with a long-run rate eventually being reached of 2.5%. The Fed repeats it will take account of the cumulative effect of rate hikes and lags in setting policy. This is again from the statement. It will continue to reduce the balance sheet by $95 billion.
타겟 레인지는 4.25에서 4.5.
Modest, inflation elevated, unemployment low, and job gains robust. So it still sees that tight job market out there. It raised the GDP this year to 0.5 from 0.2. That's because of the strength we've seen in the fourth quarter, but it lowered it to just 0.5 point for next year from 1.2. Ratcheted up a bit the unemployment rate to 4.6 from 4.4 for next year. Stays there for 2 years, by the way. And it sees inflation gradually declining to 2% by 2025. So 50 basis points, Kelly, but pretty hawkish when it comes to the outlook.
지금 허키시하게 되게 얘기를 했다 그러는데
The policy decision was unanimous. Good unanimity also, at least by the board right now, on where rates are headed, and that it's above 5%.
Hawkish, Steve, is the conclusion from markets where we've seen stocks lose all of their gains, in some cases turn negative, and the 10-year yield up about 3.5 basis points. Again, this is the first reaction. It's going to be a long afternoon. We have maybe 2 hours until we're done hearing from Powell. That said, what's the most hawkish thing about this to you? Is it those rate hike projections, the dots as we call them, especially into next year in 2024?
So there's a
이제 얼마나 떨어질지를 봐야겠네요. 지금 뭐 엄청나게
your regular terrific
꼬꾸라지고 있네.
not the special about whether the Fed is now using the
제롬 파웰이 나온다 그래가지고 다시 올라갈까?
and I think the Fed sends
그것도 퀘션이네요.
that while the market has taken all this very dovishly, loosened up financial conditions, that part of this is a message, hey, we're going above 5%. We intend to be very tough here when it comes to inflation. So that 5.1%, not just by itself, but the number of people, the change from the September survey, none of them were above 5% before, and many of them now being above, what did I say here? 17 officials now above 5. 7 officials are at 540 or higher. So there was a
지금 7명의 오피셜이 5%보다 더 올려야 된다. 2023년에 그런 내용이 담아 있다고 합니다.
We're going to talk with you a lot more, I'm sure, about this. Let's bring in our panel as well. Again, we've got a lot of folks out there, and let's bring in and introduce Bob Pisani as well. Also, Rick Santelli joins the conversation. So this group, as you can see in front of you here, has a lot of expertise, and maybe we'll send it out to Rick first with some of the reaction on the interest rate and macro side of things. It wasn't for sure, Rick.
지금 호키시하게 얘기는 나와 있는데
Nothing that was, I would characterize.
시장이 생각보다 많이 떨어지진 않아요.
Markets did move, but not by a whole heck of a lot.
지금 그렇기 때문에 조금 지금 극적극적 머리를 긁으면서 뭔가 이렇게 고민을 하고 있는 그런 거가 아닌가 지금 싶거든요.
back down a bit, but they're a little more sticky than 10s, which popped up to right under 355, came back down a bit. These are not huge moves, and in the context of the fact that we're even near 350 after having a 4.25 high yield close for 10s or 470 high yield close for 2-year, and now hovering at what, 422, 423? These rates are low, and when you look at dot plots and how far out they're predicting inflation is going to be stubborn, something isn't squaring.
신중해야 돼요. 신중해야 돼.
Interesting to hear the Q&A because the markets have definitely become very opinionated and investors are pushing back more in the treasuries than they are in equities. Yes, the equity knee-jerk reaction was down, but it wasn't huge. And if you look at the spreads, 2s to 10s inverted a several basis points more, and the dollar index improved a bit. That latter, I think the dollar index will be a good tell during the Q&A.
And we go to Bob Pisani for more on these stock moves that we're seeing. Bob, what do you make of it?
Well, I think Dom's got it right. We were down about 300 points peak to trough in the few minutes after the Fed announcement.
지금 한 차례 빠지는 거는 이루어진 것 같고요. 이제 이게 시장에서 제롬 파웰이 무슨 얘기를 어떻게 풀어갈지를 좀 기다리는 듯한 그런 느낌이 들어요. 조금.
Last week we went to 3,900. So the hope here is you either break out above 4,100 or you grind around at 3,900 or so because that seems to be where there's a lot of support. And it looks like grinding around might be the thing to do at this point. The real problem here is Wall Street is dramatically lowering the earnings estimates for 2023 because inflation is a 2022 story. Recession is the 2023 story. What side of the recession debate are you?
내용을 좀
Most
봅시다.
major
여기로
strategists now
천천히.
anticipate flat to negative earnings. 0 to down 10% is the range of the estimates for strategists on Wall Street. The average is about down 5%. So this is the problem. How do you argue for higher stock prices from here when you're in the middle of what Wall Street thinks is going to be a fairly mild earnings recession? Let's put it this way. Down 5% on earnings would be a mild earnings recession. Down 20% would be a harder landing in terms of recession. But how do you argue the S&P should be higher 6 months from now or even 8 months from now when you're potentially down 6 to 10% on earnings in 20?
이거 볼 지금 눈이 글로 가지 않네요. 저는 차트만 보이고 지금.
Multiple expansion, and Dom knows perfectly well that's a pretty hard thing to argue in a downward trending economic environment.
You know, Bob, it's an excellent point, and one that many traders have been talking about for maybe weeks now at this point, is to see whether there is that kind of a breakout.
점도표가 어딘가 있을 거예요.
잠깐만요.
점도표.
Anything from that trend standpoint. David Kelly, I'd like
인플레이션 보는 거는 지금 미디언을 보면 2023년 정도까지 되면 한 3.5까지 내려갈 가능성이 있다 보는 거네. 2024년 돼야지 이때가 되는구나. 이 사람들이 보는 거는 지금 점도표가 이거네요. 지금 5.12 쪽에 높게 찍혔네요. 그리고 올해는 뭐 지금 오늘 결정된 거고.
Well, I think the market was anticipating something more dovish in the dots than we've got here, because if you look at the Fed funds futures market as of this morning, it was looking at a terminal rate between 4.75 and 5, not between 5 and 5.
내용을 좀 천천히 봐야 될 것 같은데 이게 점도표가
In some ways, the Fed is more
아까 나온 거 점으로 딱 찍어준 거는 여기 첨부가 안 된 것 같네요.
5 and 5.25 at the end of 2023, and as of this morning, futures markets were pricing in the idea that the Fed is already going too far and will have to cut rates twice at the end of this year. So I think there's going to be a major
2023년에는
between the Fed and the markets, where the markets are saying you're overdoing it, you're going to put this economy into recession.
지금 방향이 하락으로 결정이 되어 버렸네요. 시장에서의 결정은.
So I do think I think this is a mistake. I think the Fed is trying to be hawkish to show how resolute they are against inflation, but inflation's fading anyway, and it's not worth putting the economy into recession just to hit your inflation target, a year earlier than you thought you were going to. Inflation's coming down anyway, so I'm disappointed by this, but I think this is more hawkish than markets expected.
Although, John Bellows, let's remember how dovish the dots turned out to be.
이제 문제는 어디까지 내려가느냐 그걸 봐야 돼요.
Underestimated the actual trajectory of inflation and rate hikes. So could we live through an episode like that again, to David's point, where the Fed does come around to the markets? If anything, the dots are one of the most lagging indicators that we have.
I think you're on a good point. There certainly is a little bit of a dissonance between the dots and the market, but the thing I would emphasize is that the degree of that is much smaller than it has.
일단은 이 부분까지 일단 지지가 되죠. 그다음 여기까지. 일단 여기서 한번 섰고 또 여기서 한번 제 생각에 여기는 지금 반등 매수는 없을 것 같아요. 계속 흘러내릴 것 같아요.
There is a little bit more clarity on the outlook. I think Powell in his press conference talk a lot about kind of his forward-looking expectations. And we're going to see less volatility as a consequence, and I think that's generally a good thing. So the thing I would emphasize here is there's a little bit of dissonance left, but it's a degree smaller, multiple degrees smaller than the volatility we've experienced. And that's a big transition, and it's a transition that I think will generally be supportive of financial markets, some resolution of the uncertainty, some convergence, in that forward-looking policy that I said earlier. I think that's generally a good thing, and I think that's where we're headed.
All right, so viewers, an update for you guys right now, and those listening on Sirius XM channel 112. Markets are at session lows. The Nasdaq Composite is off almost 100 points. The S&P is down about 27.
지금 하락세는 11시 30분까지는 내려가겠죠. 지금 흐름이.
So half of 1% declines. The Dow is now down 165.
이제 마이너스 1% 정도 빠지기 순간으로 가니까.
We started you off with kind of the macro picture and what the expectations were. The way that the markets are shaping up right now seems to indicate, at least, that the initial part of next year could be a little bit more, say, biased to the downside, but maybe not as volatilely so as it's been. if you stack things up with the data that we've seen today from the Fed and the CPIs and the PPIs and everything else, does this then still mean that the path
그 와중에 테슬라는 156까지 내려갔네요.
or do we test the lows? Do we set new ones here in early 2023?
Yeah, it's a great point. And look, I think to John's point earlier, we are headed towards a 5% plus terminal rate according to today's dot plot, but really the market wasn't too far off of that. And so 5% or so means probably 2 more 25 basis point rate hikes. Maybe the Fed is giving itself some room in case inflation does become more volatile. But I also agree with David that inflation is starting to show signs of rolling over, and there are several leading indicators that we follow that do indicate that inflation will probably continue to move in this downward direction. Interestingly, I do think the Fed is being a bit conservative, so they have 3.5% core inflation by the end of 2023. I think there have been so many calls that the Fed has been wrong on inflation to the upside that now they want to be a little bit more cautious to the downside, and perhaps the same way they're giving themselves a little bit of room in the Fed funds rate. Now, to your point on do we retest the lows, certainly we think there's a period of volatility ahead of us as we get through not only an economics downgrade, but the earnings downgrade that was mentioned earlier. But that being said, this is what we are calling the worst kept secret on Wall Street. You know, this recession or this period of economic downturn is well known and established by not only Wall Street, but a lot of people are talking about it already.
Yeah.
We do think that if markets do enter a period of volatility, it could potentially be short-lived in that they will start very quickly then looking towards this period of recovery ahead. And keep in mind, when you do look at history, the analysis shows us that markets actually start recovering anywhere from 3 to 6 months before a recession ends. And so these forward-looking markets, we think, continue in 2023 for sure. And really, we start transitioning from defensive portfolios.
진짜 호키시한 걸까? 아니면은 지금
Kind of quick comment as we start to turn our attention to the Fed conference.
뉴스 릴리즈만 이렇게 호키시하게 얘기하는 걸까?
You know, I would be listening for the notion that higher for longer, and I believe even if we start to show more dramatically heading towards a recession, I think the key to this move by the Fed, this whole tightening cycle, is that they're going to be much tougher to actually reverse and turn corners and lower rates. I think that's what you want to concentrate on. And if you look at May Fed fund futures, and I've been looking at May, that's been roughly the fulcrum between April, May, June. But it had a dramatic break, a very dramatic break. And my phone was going off because many of my sources that trade were telling me that changed the way they traded 2s, 10s, 30s in the stock market after watching the dramatic 10 basis point drop in May Fed fund futures.
All right, Steve Leisman, we're going to give the last word to you here as we wrap up this panel. The takeaway and what you will be listening for and asking Fed Chair Jay Powell during this press conference.
Here's the thing. There is now the need for a daily Leisman-Santelli show. Market said what, Fed said what. I don't agree that we're heading for a period of lower volatility. I think there's more volatility because I think, you know, Rick is very focused on what the market is saying. My job is to report to you in detail what the Fed is saying. That gap grew today. Rick is right. We did have a strong move in that May 2023 contract up to 492 from 482.
그래도 S&P는 4,000대는 지금 유지가 되고 있어요.
When you look out the curve to the January 24 as a
이걸 1분 차트로 좀 바꿔 놓을게요. 1분 차트로 내야죠.
sees itself ending the year at that 5 1/8 number, and the market thinks they're going to end in the 440 range. So there's 60, 70 basis points of difference between the markets. I think we have some discussions that have to be had, some explaining that has to be done about where the market is priced and where the Fed thinks we're going, and somebody's going to have to give something here. I don't necessarily think Kelly Evans was wrong earlier when she pointed out how wrong the Fed has been, but somebody's got to turn tail here, either the markets or the Fed, and this is going to be a very interesting story from here. I look forward to continued discussions with my colleague from Chicago, Rick Santelli.
All right, one of the best panels around to break down Fed decisions and economic data. Thanks to our panel, John Bellows, Mona Mahajan, David Kelly.
야, 근데 테슬라는 정말 오늘 잘못하면 150 가겠어요. 150 밑까지.
Here on out, coming up, former Fed Governor Frederick Mishkin will tell us how high he thinks rates should go and for how long. Our analysis of the central bank decision continues with the press conference starting in less than 15 minutes time. This often ends up being
또 15분 동안 이렇게 아주 고역스럽게 있어야겠네요. 이제 좀 데이터를 무슨 내용들이 있었나 봅시다. Table 1, Economic Projection, Federal Member, there's individual assumption projection appropriate money policy. GDP growth에 대한 얘기가 나온 거네요. 0.5. GDP growth가 내년에 0.5가 될 것이다. September projection은 1.2였는데 실제로 0.5였고 Unemployment rate이 지금 3.7인데 4.6을 기대하고 있고 September projection은 4.1이었다. PC 인플레이션은 9월에는 2.8을 기대했는데 지금 3.1이고 코어는 3.1, 3.2. 그러니까 예상한 것보다 다 조금씩 높다 이렇게 보는 거고 펀드 레이트는 2023년에 지금 5.1. 요거가 이제 좀 악재로 나온 것 같아요. 요거가 이 부분이 지금 악재로 나온 것 같고 그 다음에 나온 게 Median Central Tendencies and Range Economy Projection 2022년에서 2025년까지의 경기 GDP 전망 성장이 미디언으로 보면 거의 뭐 0.5, 0.5, 1.6 리세션을 여기서 설명을 하는 것 같아요. 그리고 고용지표는 미디언으로 보면은 고용이 2023년, 2024년, 2025년에 4.6, 4.5 정도 된다. 그러니까 이렇게 지금 설계를 하고 있는 거죠. 인플레이션은 2023년대에서 3.0대로 내려가면서 일단은 이제 좀 인플레이션은 잡히는 흐름으로 가지 않느냐 그렇게 봐야 될 것 같네요. 코어도 마찬가지고 2023년 후반까지는 봐야 된다 이거죠. 이거는 무엇이냐? 이게 점도표예요. 점이 아니라 숫자로 나와서 그렇지만 지금 여기 2023년 터미널 레이시 5.125. 그러니까 지금 이거면은 앞으로 0.75를 더 올린다는 얘기가 나오죠. 그렇죠? 그리고 이거는 Distribution of Participant Projection of Changes in Real GDP. 이것도 뭐 GDP 그러니까 GDP는 뭐 우리가 그렇게 지금 아무리 얘기해도 머릿속에서 굴러가지 않을 것 같고 이것도 그렇고 고용 그 정도만 지금 아시면 될 것 같네요. 오늘 나온 얘기는 이거고 이제 12분 후에 제롬 파월 나와가지고 얘기하는 게 중요할 것 같네요. 일단 주가 하락세는 일단 스탑한 것 같아요. 크게 하락하는 거는. 예, 오늘 어제 그렇죠. 마이크 뉴턴도 지금 어제 4,100을 브레이크아웃 한 게 false signal이다. 그렇게 얘기하기도 하고 며칠 전부터 지금 계속 마이클 윌슨이 블룸버그에서 나와서도 얘기하고 이제 택티컬 랠리는 끝났다. 이제 그런 얘기를 하고 있습니다.
Because I think that actually that they have to go to higher rates than the market's anticipating, and also that the dot plots are indicating as well. So I actually also like to be more preemptive. Again, this has to do with the fact that they dropped preemption, which is a huge mistake. So I think that they have to get back to indicate they really are going to be ahead of the curve.
이제는 안 좋은 뉴스는 안 좋은 뉴스로, 좋은 뉴스는 좋은 뉴스로 먹힐 그럴 타이밍이죠. 여기까지는 이제는 이제 뭐랄까 원론적으로 들어갈 거예요. 여기까지는 너무 심리적, 센티멘트적으로 들어갔지만 이제는 원론적으로 시장을 다시 봐야 하는 그런 위치에 와 있을 수도 있습니다. 시장이 원한 거는 피벗을 원한 건 아니에요. 그냥 피벗한 무브, 그러니까 속도를 좀 줄이든 거, 빠른 차선에서 좀 슬로우 레인으로 차선 변경을 하는 거 정도를 기대했는데 어쨌거나 지금 차선 변경은 된 거 아닙니까? 75에서 50이니까. 근데 문제는 내가 얼마만큼 더 가야 되는 그 구간을 보는 건데 그 구간이 좀 더 길어진 것 같다. 그런 생각이 드는 거죠.
Well, I certainly don't think they're too restrictive. That's for sure. Because what you have to think about is it's not the actual federal funds rate that's important. It's what we call
지금 여기 CNBC 뉴스에 나오는 헤드라인을 제가 하나씩 읽어 드릴게요. 눈에 보이는 대로.
Because for at least for the next couple of years, it's very likely that inflation is going to be not getting down below the 3% level. and that it's going to take a while longer than that. And so right now, they've only gone to sort of moderate tightening. It's not really, in fact, they've just really gotten to neutral.
뉴 타겟 요번에는 50 베이시스 포인트 올린 건 맞고 지금 제가 보는 어제 종가가 여기에요. 여기 지점.
Inflation, as you know, is a lagging indicator. I mean, the inflation we're experiencing now is from monetary policy that was set into place 18 months ago.
Absolutely, but in terms of actually the kind of numbers that we see in terms of looking forward to what we think inflation is going to be, we don't really see numbers below 3% for a while. Now, I could actually we might get lucky, and in fact,
그저께네,
go below that. But I think expectations
그저께 종가.
inflation is still well above the Fed's target.
그저께 종가
And from that
밑에.
viewpoint, for quite a period of time, I'd like to see the Fed.
어제 종가는 깼죠 벌써. 어제 종가는 깼고 그저께 종가. 지금 그저께 종가가 요 지점이에요. 어제 종가는 여기였으니까.
And start to pause too early. That's what I really worry about. So in that case, it's not so much that I worry about the actual rise.
지금 페드에서 보는 거는 성장은 슬로우돼지고 인플레이션 아직 있다. 그리고 아직도 잡이 많다. 그런 얘기를 자꾸 해요. 얘는 잡이 실제로 많지 않을 텐데. 그리고 포캐스트를 0.5. 2002년 GDP, 2022년 GDP는 뭐 0.5, 0.1. 0.2를 예상했는데 0.5가 됐고 내년에 GDP는 1.2를 예상하고 있었는데 0.5가 될 것이다. 그리고 unemployment 아까 본 거예요. unemployment rate는 4.4를 프로젝션 했었는데 4.6이 될 것이다. 이렇게 변경했다는 거예요.
Is there a case to be made that these days, this decade, that long and variable lag has become shorter? That we see policy impacts in as little as 3 to 6 to 9 months as opposed to 18, like Kelly pointed out before.
여기가 깨지면 어디까지 갈지 잠깐만 볼게요. 여기가 깨지면은 그 다음에는 요쯤이에요. 피벗이네 피벗. 여기 피벗 있는 데고 여기가 깨지면은
It's not easy to do so. You can make some big mistakes.
여기쯤 되겠네요.
Did make in this recent cycle, but that's just the job. It's part of what you have to do. And in fact, this is also an indication that you're operating under uncertainty. That sometimes you have to actually ask which of the balance of risks that you think are much more dangerous. And in this particular episode, not getting inflation under control right now is actually quite dangerous. Sure. So that's
뭐 예측하고 속단하기는 어렵지만 굳이 연준이 제롬 파웰이 나와가지고 이쁜 얘기를 하지는 않을 것 같아요.
Which I think is not the right time to do so.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Great thoughts. Frederick Mishkin, former Fed governor.
지금 시장의 이름 말하는 것들이 다들 아주 침체된 분위기를 보여주고 있네요. 이제 6분 정도, 5분 정도 남았습니다. 문제는 이제는 어떻게 되느냐지. 이제부터가 중요해요. 이제부터. 오늘 이렇게 나왔으면은 12월에 산타랠리 1월에 상승 뭐 그런 거 없죠. 그냥 짤 없죠. 짤 없이 그냥 쫙 가는 거지 이제. 그래도 생각보다 많이 안 밀렸어요. 생각보다 많이 안 밀렸어. 제가 아침에 그랬죠. 여기 밀려도 한 요 정도까지 유지되지 않을까 그랬는데, 근데 이렇게 되면 이제 내일부터가 문제인데, 앞으로 오늘 만약에 제롬 파웰 기자회견에서 주가 방향을 하락으로 설정을 해버리면 이제 계속 흘러내리면은 이제 요 갭까지 갈 가능성이 생기는 거죠. 까지는 않지만 그냥 계속 흘러내리겠죠. 계속. 그리고 내일 옵션 만기일 숏 커버 하는 사람들도 숏 커버를 바로 들어가지 않고 좀 더 가지고 있을 가능성이 높다. 그런 것도 우리가 고려를 해봐야 돼요. 이제 옵션 만기 세만년의 날인데 옵션을 롤오버를 하겠죠. 이제 다음 주 정도까지 내려가게. 테크니컬적으로는 지금 여기서 반등이 나올 수 있는 상황인데 큰 반등은 아니고 그냥 이렇게 추세적으로 반등인데 그게 큰 반등으로 연결될지는 좀 살펴봐야 될 것 같아요. 어떻게 됐나 지금 모든 것들이 달러가 달러는 아직도 빠지고 오늘 0.3대까지 내려왔네요. 달러. 그리고 10년물은 3.53까지 올라갔고요. 제가 TLT 팔으라 그랬죠. 수익 실현 한번 하시라 그랬죠. 그리고 다른 부분은 빅스는 0.3 정도밖에 안 올라갔어요. 그러니까 충격파가 그렇죠? 생각보다 그렇게 크진 않아요.
News conference it starts in just a couple of minutes time. We saw stocks. We'll talk to Mike Santoli down at the New York Stock Exchange. Mike, we saw stocks immediately sell off and yields pop a little bit on the decision. Everyone seems to think if Powell were to lean one way, hawkish would be that way. But there's still a risk he could open the door to use some language about needing to soften the pace depending on how the data comes in or something to that effect.
Without a doubt, Kelly. I mean, he can certainly acknowledge progress in various areas on inflation, those that he laid out not too long ago in that speech that the market took heart in. So, yes, I do think there is that opening. I think what the market is initially reacting to is not just the higher projected Fed funds rate where it's going to get to next year, but also in combination with the economic and inflation forecast that the committee put together, right? So they're saying growth is going to be worse than we thought 3 months ago, 0.5% GDP growth. That's as close as the Fed's going to get to predicting recession. And meanwhile, core inflation higher than we thought just 3 months ago. So that combination is unsettling. If they think inflation is going to be even higher while growth slows down, unemployment has to go up into the mid-4s is what they're saying. And even with that, they're going to keep Fed funds above 5%. Now, all that is subject to the markets disagreeing with it and deciding to take the other side. And you've been pointing out, and I think it's in all investors' heads, that
이제 상당히 시장이 혼란스러운데 지금.
The Fed was very wide of the mark with what the outlook was going to be and what they were going to have to do. So at some point, you can fight the Fed if you feel as if their premises are not necessarily realistic.
But Mike, you can fight the Fed, but you're not going to do it from a career-long or short perspective if you don't have more data, right? I mean, is there anything that we're going to see between now and say the early part of January, February, as we head into the next part of the interest rate cycle in the early part of next year that breaks the market out of any part of the range that we've already seen for the past 2 or 3 months?
Well, I think what you can see, Dom, is, first of all, the PCE inflation numbers, as people are trying to put them together in advance, they're going to show decelerating core inflation. So people are maybe going to be able to...
왼쪽은 스파이, 오른쪽은 나스닥 선물입니다.
downside momentum, and therefore, the Fed may not have to go as far as they thought, or maybe growth can be more resilient. So I think that every data point is going to be filtered through, this set of expectations that the Fed committee has put out there. And look, we've absorbed a lot. The stock market's in the same place it was when the Fed funds rate was at 0.75% back in the spring. So it's not as if every tick in what the Fed...
저 5% 정도 더 올라 0.75 아닌가?
It's all about how we're getting there and how much
아까 보니까
And we've just got a couple seconds left. What's the one thing you'd be watching for in the press conference?
여기서 어디였지?
I would say he's going to say we're not done. He's going to talk about higher for
지나갔나?
longer. And he did say
여기.
he actually gives a nod to the CPI data we got yesterday.
지금 4.5에서
Rent calculations from
0.5 두 번? 0.5 지금 4.5, 2.5에서 4.5잖아요. 그렇죠? 3.75 0.25라고 치면 5로 간다 그러면은 75 베이시스 포인트 75 베이시스 포인트 더 올린다. 그렇게 저는 저렇게 봤는데 여기 보면 요 차이 지금 현재 있는 게 여기 중간값이니까 여기거든요. 그다음에 여기니까 7호 나오셨네요, 할아버지.
Before I go into the details of today's meeting, I'd like to underscore for the American people that we understand the hardship that high inflation is causing and that we are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. Over the course of the year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy.
0.2%까지 가는 걸로 한다 뭐 그런 얘기해요.
The full effects of our rapid tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do.
할 일이 더 많다.
Stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy.
원칙을 얘기합니다.
Without price stability, the economy doesn't work for anyone. In particular, without price
물가 안정을 자기네들이 목표로 하고 물가 안정 없이는 경제가 성장할 수 없다.
market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised our policy interest rate by a half percentage point.
50 베이시스 포인트 올렸고
Ongoing increases will be appropriate in order to
그리고 계속 상승시키는 게
sufficiently restrictive to
적합할 것 같다.
2% over time. In addition, we're continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet.
밸런스 시트 축소하고
Restoring
있다.
price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive policy stance for some time.
아직도 제한적인 그 리스트릭트한 스탠스를 가져야
Policy
된다.
actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy has slowed significantly from last year's rapid pace.
지난해부터
GDP rose at a pace of 2.9% last
경기
quarter.
침체가 되고 있다.
It was roughly unchanged through the first 3 quarters of this year. Recent indicators point to modest growth of spending and production this quarter. Growth in consumer spending has slowed from last year's rapid pace, in part reflecting lower real disposable income and tighter financial.
컨슈머 스pen딩이 좀 줄어들고 있다 그런 얘기하고 있고요.
Activity in the housing sector has weakened significantly, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. As shown in our summary of economic projections, the median projection for real GDP growth stands at just 0.5% this year and next.
아까 우리 도표본 얘기하는 거예요.
The longer run normal growth rate.
GDP 올라가는 0.5%밖에 안 올라갈 것이다.
Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight, with the unemployment rate near a
또 노동시장은 좋다 뭐 이런 얘기를 하고
vacancy
있고
still very high and wage growth elevated.
임금이 상승하고
Gains
있다.
have been robust, with employment rising by an average of 272,000 jobs per month over the last 3 months. Although job vacancies have moved below their highs and the pace of job gains has slowed from earlier in the year, the labor market continues to be out of balance, with demand substantially exceeding the supply of available workers.
지금 레이버 마켓은 디맨드가 더 많다 그런 얘기하고
Is little changed since the beginning of the year. FOMC participants expect supply and demand conditions in the labor market to come into better balance
지금
over time.
고용 참여자가 아직도 늘어나지 않고 있다.
Wages and prices. The median projection in the SEP for the unemployment rate rises to 4.6% at the end of next year. Inflation remains well above our longer run.
실업률은 4.7까지 올라간다 뭐 그런
Over the
얘기하고
12
있고
months ending in October, total PCE prices rose 6%, excluding the volatile food and energy categories. Core PCE.
아까 봤던 요 표에 대한 거 설명을 하나하나 하고 있는 것 같아요. 글로써.
12-month change in the CPI was 7.1%, and the change in the core CPI was 6%. The inflation data received so far for October and November show a welcome reduction in the monthly pace of price increases. But it will take substantially more evidence to give confidence that inflation is on a
인플레이션이 더 내려가는 거에 대해 가지고 자기네들이 더 확고한 데이터가 필요하다.
evident across a broad range of goods and
10월,
services.
11월에는 낮았지만
Russia's war against Ukraine has boosted prices for energy and food and has
또
contributed
러시아 유크레인 사태 얘기하고 지난번에 얘기한 거랑 비슷해요. 에너지랑 음식 올라가고 있다.
PCE inflation is 5.6% this year and falls 3.1% next year. 2.5% in 2024.
아까 봤던 차트대로 내년에는 3.5, 그 다음에는 2.5까지 예상하고 있다.
Participants continue to see risks to inflation as weighted to the upside. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that is not grounds for complacency. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able
인플레이션이 높은 것 때문에 구매력이 떨어지고 있다.
housing and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective.
똑같은 얘기, 2%까지 내리는 게 목표다.
Raise the target range for the federal funds rate by a half percentage point, bringing the target range to 4.25% to 4.5%. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 4.25 percentage points this year. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. Over the course of the year, financial conditions have tightened significantly in response to our policy actions. Financial conditions fluctuate in the short term in response to many factors, but it is important that over time,
위험 상태가 단기적으로는 상당히 플럭추에이션 할 것이다.
the policy restraint that we're putting in place to
하지만 장기적으로는 안정이 될 것이다.
We are seeing the effects on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the economy, such as housing. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee decided to raise interest rates by 50 basis points today, a step down from the 75 basis point pace seen over the previous 4 meetings.
지금 페이스를 줄였다는 얘기를 하고 있어요. 75에서 50으로 내렸다는 얘기.
And we still have some ways to go.
하지만 좀 더 가야 갈 일이 있다.
The median projection for the appropriate level of the federal funds rate is 5.1% at the end of next year, a half
터미널 레이
percent
5.1.
projected in September. The median projection is 4.1% at the end of 2024 and 3.1% at the end of 2025, still above the median estimate of its longer run value. Of course, these projections do not represent a committee decision or plan, and no one knows with any certainty where the economy will be a year or more from now. Our decisions will depend on the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. And we will continue to make our decisions
지금 주가는 피벗에서 걸려서 지금 버티고 있네요.
as possible. We are taking forceful steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a sustained period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the
지금은 상당히 원론적인 얘기를 하고 있어요. 인플레이션을 내리고 이자율을 올려서
prematurely loosening policy. We will
얘기하는
stay
것
course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I will look forward to your questions.
마지막에 얘기한 것들은 원론적인 거 얘기한 거예요.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Thanks for taking my
고통을
question.
받아
You just talked
일단
about the
들어볼게요.
importance of market conditions reflecting the policy restraint you put in place. Since the November meeting, the 10-year has declined by 60 basis points. Mortgage rates have come down. High-yield credit spreads have come in. The economy's accelerated, and the stock market's up 6%. Is this loosening of financial conditions a problem for the Fed in its effort and its fight against inflation? And if so, do you need to do something about that, and how would you do something about that? Thank you.
So as I mentioned, it is important that overall financial conditions continue to reflect the policy restraint that we're putting in place to bring inflation down to 2%. We think that financial conditions have tightened significantly in the past year. but our policy actions work through financial conditions, and those in turn affect economic activity, the labor market, and inflation. So what we control is our policy moves and the communications that we make. Financial conditions both anticipate and react to our actions. I would add that our focus is not on short-term moves, but on persistent moves, and many things, of course, move financial conditions over time. I would say it's our judgment today that we're not at a sufficiently restrictive policy stance yet, which is why we say that we would expect that ongoing hikes will
아직도 리스트릭티브하게 충분한 상황이 아니라 그런 얘기를 하네요.
our current assessment of what that peak level will be. As you will have seen, 19 people filled out the SEP this time, and 17 of those 19 wrote down a peak rate of 5% or more, in the fives. So that's our
19명 중에서 17명이 5%보다 더 높아야 된다. 그렇게 오늘 서베이가 된 거예요.
At each subsequent SEP during the course of this year, we've actually increased our estimate of what that peak rate will be. And today, the SEP that we're published shows again that overwhelmingly FOMC participants believe that inflation risks are to the upside. So I can't tell you confidently.
지금 인플레이션이 더 올라갈 것 같다. 그런 리스크가 있다는 거를 리스크가 더 올라갈 것 같다. 그렇게 생각하기 때문에 이자율을 더 올려야 된다. 그렇게 얘기하고 있다는 거예요.
Estimate of what we think that peak rate will be based on what we know. Obviously, if the inflation data come in worse, that could move up. And it could move down if inflation data are softer.
뭐 인플레이션에 따라가지고 좀 변경이 된다. 그런 얘기를 마지막에 언버무린 것 같아요.
Gina Smilik, New York Times. Thanks for taking our questions. The SEP, like you mentioned, suggests that the Fed will be making another 3/4 percentage points worth of rate increases in 2023. I wonder if you would foresee that being in 25 basis point increments, 50 basis point increments, sort of how you see the speed playing out going forward. And then I wonder what
오케이, 앞으로 올리는 거를 스피드에 대해서 물어보네요. 50으로 올릴 거냐, 25로 올릴 거냐 그런 거에 대한 질문이에요.
So as I've been saying, as we've gone through the course of this year, as we lifted off and got into the course of the year, and we saw how strong inflation was and how persistent, it was very important to move quickly. In fact, the speed, the pace with which we were moving was the most important thing. I think now that we're coming to the end of this year, we've raised 425 basis points this year, and we're into restrictive territory. It's now not so important how fast we go. It's far more important to think what is the ultimate level, and then at a certain point, the question will become how long do we remain restrictive? That will become.
지금이랑 똑같은 얘기를 지난번이랑 똑같은 얘기를 해요. 스피드가 중요한 거 아니다. 얼마나 더 가고 얼마나 길게 가는 게 더 중요하다.
So I think we'll make the February decision based on the incoming data and where we see financial conditions, where we see the economy, and that'll be the key thing. But I mean, for that decision, but. Ultimately, that question about how high to raise rates is going to be one that we make looking at our progress on inflation, looking at where financial conditions are, and making an assessment of whether policy is restrictive enough.
속도 높이, 그다음에 기간에 대한 얘기를 했어요. 지난번이랑 똑같은 얘기예요. 속도가 중요한 거 아니다. 2월에 나올 데이터를 보고서 2월에 결정해야 될 것이다.
Point, and then the question will be how long do we stay there? And there the strong view on the committee is that we'll need to stay there, until we're really confident that inflation's coming down in a sustained way, and we think that will be some time. Now, why do I say that? If you look at you can break inflation down into three sort of buckets. The first is goods inflation, and we see.
저번 때 얘기한 거랑 똑같아요. 세 개. Goods inflation. 이 물건에 대한 인플레이션은 일단 서플라이 체인이 좋아지면 해결이 될 것이다. 지난번 브루킹에서 얘기한 거랑 비슷해요. 하우징 서비스. 하우징 서비스 인플레이션은 계속 올라갈 것 같다.
As rents expire and have to be renewed, they're going to be renewed into a market.
왜냐하면 렌트가 이제 리뉴하게 되면은 그때 이제 또 올라가는 게 보일 거니까.
New leases that the rate for new leases is coming down. So once we work our way through that backlog, that inflation will come down sometime next.
근데 new rent는 지금 또 내려갈 거고.
55% of the index, PCE, core inflation index, is non-housing related core services, and that's really a
core PCE.
largely at the biggest cost by far in that sector is labor, and we do see a very
labor 얘기가 나오네요. PC.
one where we haven't seen much softening, where job growth is very high, where wages are very high, vacancies
지금 wage high하다는 얘기 나오죠.
elevated, and really there's an imbalance in the labor market.
Wage inflation.
So that part of it, which is the biggest part, is likely to take a substantial period to get down. The goods inflation has turned pretty quickly now.
그러니까 세 가지로 봤을 때 주택, 그다음에 레이버 쪽은 상당히 오랜 시간이 걸릴 것이다. 안정되는 데까지는. 근데 그 물건에서 생기는 인플레이션은 곧 잡힐 것이다.
So we may have to raise rates higher to get to where we want to go, and that's really why we are writing down those high rates and why we're expecting that they'll have to remain high for a time.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thanks for taking the question. You described GDP growth in the SEPs as moderate or modest, I believe, yet it's really approaching stall speed. Half a percentage point is not much. You described labor market unemployment rate as representing some softening, but it's nearly a full percentage point rise, and that's well in excess of what has historically been associated with recession. Why wouldn't this be considered a recessionary projection by the Fed?
왜 프로젝션을 리세션이라는 거를 리세션이라고 가정하고 그렇게 프로젝션을 했느냐 거기에 대한 질문이에요.
Expectations in the SEP are basically, as you said, which is we've got growth at a modest level, which is to say about a half a percentage point. That's positive growth. It's slow growth. It's well below trend. It's not going to feel like a boom. It's going to feel like very slow growth, right? In that condition, labor market conditions are softening a bit. Unemployment does go up a bit. I would say that many analysts believe that the natural rate of unemployment is actually elevated at this moment. So it's not clear that those forecasts of inflation are really much above the natural rate of unemployment. We can never identify its location with great precision.
지금은 naturally 보이는 unemployment rate보다 더 빨리 unemployment rate이 올라가기 때문에 리세션의 사인으로 본다. 그런 얘기를 하나 했고요.
Companies are very reluctant to lay people off, other than the tech companies, which is a story unto itself. Generally, companies want to hold on to the workers they have because it's been very, very hard to hire. So, and you've got all these vacancies out there far in excess of the number of employed people. That doesn't sound like a labor market where a lot of people will need to be put out of work. So that there are channels through which the labor market can come back into balance with relatively modest increases in unemployment, we believe. None of that is guaranteed, but that is what their forecast reflects.
하여튼 연준에서 보는 거는 리세션으로 가는 거, 소프트하게 리세션을 보는 건다고.
Chair Powell, I want to follow up on Gina's question. The decision to step down the pace of rate rises appears to have been socialized at your last meeting, largely before the past two CPI reports showed inflation decelerating in line with the committee's forecast this year. You just now talked about making decisions meeting by meeting and being mindful of the lags of policy. Does that mean, all things equal, you would feel more comfortable probing where the terminal rate is by moving in 25 basis point increments, including beginning at your next meeting?
So I haven't made a judgment on what size rate hike to make at the last meeting. But what you said is broadly right, which is having moved so quickly and having now so much restraint that's still in the pipeline, we think that the appropriate thing to do now is to move to a slower pace. And that will
또 슬로우 페이스 얘기가 나오니까 주가가 올라가네요.
And get to that level, we think, and better balance the risks that we face. So that's the idea. It makes a lot of sense, it seems to me.
그러니까 너무 빨리 강하게 가는 것보다는 강하게 하면 위험하기 때문에 조금 속도를 조절하는 건 어프로프리트하다 그런 얘기는 하는데 어떤 식으로 할 거에 대해서는 뭐 얘기하기가 좀 지금은 경제 상황이나 데이터에 우선 맞춰야 된다 그렇게 얘기를 하고 끝나네요.
No, absolutely not. No, as just a matter of practice, the SEP reflects any data that comes out during the meeting, And participants know that they know this, that they can make changes to their SEP during the meeting, well in advance of the press conference so that we're not running around. But that's not the case. It's never the case that the SEPs don't reflect an important piece of data that came in on the first day of the meeting.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thank you for taking our questions. I'm wondering if we could talk about the projection for the unemployment rate. Why has the Fed raised its unemployment projection? Is it because the model suggests that a higher terminal rate would automatically cause a higher unemployment rate?
오케이, 왜 비고용 unemployment rate를 올리게 프로젝션을 했냐?
Labor market is clearly very strong. It is more just that by now we've continually expected to make faster progress on inflation than we have ultimately, and that's why the peak rate for this year goes up between this meeting and the September meeting. You see the fact that we've made less progress than expected on inflation, so that's why that goes up, and that's why unemployment goes up, because we're having to tighten policy more. And so it didn't go up by much in the meeting, I don't think, but that's the idea, is slower progress on inflation, tighter policy, probably higher rates, probably held for longer, just to get to where the kind of restriction that you need to get inflation down to 2%.
In order to get to that number, how much of that could be caused by layoffs versus vacancies trimming or changes to the labor force population rate?
It's very hard to say. You can look at history, right? And history would say that.
질문은 이거였어요. 4.6%의 실업률을 만들려면은 얼마나 레이오프를 해야 되냐? 그랬더니 답변은
Why do we think that is the case? I'll give you a few reasons. First, just is that there's this huge overhang of vacancies.
지금 overhang vacancy가
come
있다.
down a fair amount, and we're hearing from many companies that they don't want to lay people off, so that they'll keep people because it's been so hard. I mean, I think it feels like we have a structural labor shortage out there, where there 4 million
지금 structural labor shortage가 있고
who are in the workforce available to work, then there's demand for workforce. So the fact that there's a strong labor market, means that companies will hold on to workers, and it means that it may take longer, but it also means that the costs in unemployment may be less. Again, that we're going to find out empirically, but I think that's a reasonably possible outcome, and you do hear many labor economists believe that it is. So we'll see, though.
답변이 좀 별로 의미가 없는데. 얼마나 레이오프 될 거냐고 물어봤더니 다른 얘기라고
How should
하네요.
we interpret the higher core inflation forecast for 2023 in the SEP? Does that not then suggest that the policy rate currently forecasted for next year should actually be higher than the 5.1 medium estimate penciled in?
Well, I think that's why one of the reasons it went up was that core came in stronger this year. Yeah, what you see is our best estimate as of today, really. As of today, for how high we need to raise rates, to how much we need to tighten policy to create enough, restrictive policy to slow economic activity and soften the labor market and bring inflation down through those channels. That is the estimate, best estimate we make today, and as I mentioned, we'll make another estimate for the next SEP, and we'll, of course, between meetings we do the same thing, but we don't publish it.
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. I wanted to make sure I understand specifically what's going on in the SEP, because you all expect rates to go higher, but you're also more pessimistic about what inflation is going to look like next year. And I was just wondering, given that we have seen some cooling in inflation, is that primarily because of wage growth, that you expect wage growth to
이렇게 질문을 얘기해요. 왜 이자율을 더 높이냐? 우리가 데이터 보면 인플레이션 내려가고 있는데 지금 웨이지 인플레이션 때문에 그러냐? 그렇게 질문했어요.
The level that we're moving down to next year is still a very large drop in inflation from where inflation is running now, well more than a 1% change in inflation. But remember that the jump-off point at the beginning of the year is higher. So we're moving down still by a very large chunk. I don't think the policy's having any less effect. It's just starting from a higher level at the end of 2022. So we're getting down. I believe the median is 3.5%. That's a pretty significant drop in inflation. And where's it coming from? It's coming from the goods sector clearly. By the middle of next year, we should begin to see lower inflation from the housing services sector. And then,
내년 중반쯤에는 하우징 섹터의 인플레이션 좀 내려갈 것이다. 그렇게 보고 있대요.
Which is the non-housing services sector, and that's where you need to see. We believe you need to see a better balancing of supply and demand in the labor market, so that you have. It's not that we don't want wage increases. We want
지금 이렇게 소리가 나오는 거 보면은
2% inflation. Right now,
글쎄 그렇게 큰 충격적으로 받아들일 것 같지는 않네요. 지금 시장이.
wages are running,
이게 회의가 끝나고 주가를 좀 되돌림을 할 수 있지 않을까 하는 그런 기대도 살짝 해보게 되네요.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. Some of your colleagues have been pretty explicit that they can't imagine rate cuts happening in 2023. That's certainly not implied by the SEP. But futures markets have priced in some easing in the back half of next year. What's your view of the likelihood of any kind of rate cuts next year? What circumstances might make that plausible?
Our focus right now.
지금 레이 컷에 대해서 질문했어요.
Moving our policy stance to one that is restrictive enough to assure a return of inflation to our 2% goal over time. It's not on rate cuts. And we think that we'll have to maintain a restrictive stance of policy for some time. Historical experience cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. I guess I would say it this way. I wouldn't
prematurely loosening policy 하는 건 좋지 않다는 얘기를 계속하고 있고요.
That inflation is moving down to 2% in a sustained way. So that's the test I would articulate. And you're correct. There are not rate cuts in the SEP for 2023.
2023년에는 레이 컷은 없다.
Steve Matthews with Bloomberg. Let me ask you about China. In the last few weeks, China has abandoned
달러가 떨어진다는 거는 경기 침체.
policy and been reopening pretty strongly. I'm wondering if you see that as
그리고 10년물도 거의 안 오르고 있죠. 지금 0.3이에요.
chains improve or inflationary because it obviously brings a lot more demand globally, improves the global outlook for growth and for commodities prices.
And so you're right. Those two things will offset each other. Weaker output in China will push down on commodity prices, but it could interfere with supply chains ultimately, and that could push inflation up in the West. It's very hard to say, how.
이제 중국에서 이제 서플라이가 좀 들어오기 시작하면 인플레이션이 떨어지지 않겠느냐 그런 얘기했는데 그렇게 하면 또 수요가 늘어나가지고 인플레이션이 올라갈 것 같다. 하여튼 인플레이션은 상당히 겁나는 것으로 이렇게 보고 있는 것 같아요.
In reopening, we've seen waves of COVID all around the world can interfere with economic activity. China, a very critical manufacturing place for manufacturing and exporting. Their supply chain is very important. And China faces a reopening. They've backed away from their COVID restriction policies. There could be very significant increases in COVID, and we'll just have to see. It's a risky situation, but again, it doesn't seem like it's likely to have material overall effects on us.
Hi, Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. Thank you for taking my question. I wondered if you could comment a bit more about
질문이 점점 이제 약해지고 있어요.
showed inflation cooling in all three of the
주가가 반등할 것 같은데 끝나고 나서 뭐 예상했던 바 대로다 뭐 이런 식으로.
inflation under control. Are you still worried it could slip into some kind of unentrenched, upward spiral? Thank you.
Right. So the data that we've received so far for October and November, we don't have we have some remaining data to get in November, but they clearly do show a welcome reduction in the monthly pace of price increases. As I mentioned in my opening statement, it will take substantially more evidence to give confidence that inflation is on a sustained downward path. So the way we think about this is this. This report is very much in line with what we've been expecting and hoping for. And what it does is it provides greater confidence in our forecast of declining inflation. As I mentioned, we've been forecasting significant declines in overall inflation and core inflation in the coming year. And this is the kind of reading that it will take to support that. So really this gives us greater confidence in our forecast rather than at this point changing our forecast. In terms of the pieces, we have been expecting goods inflation to come down as supply chain pressures eased. That's happening now. Housing services, as I mentioned, there is good news in the pipeline as long as
계속 똑같은 얘기하고 있어요. 물가 그러니까 우리 goods inflation은 떨어지고 있고 이제 내년 중반에 하우싱은 떨어질 거다. 이제 서비스의 문제예요. 그러니까 임금 때문에 올라가는 그게 가장 큰 문제다.
Of PCE core index.
More than half.
It's very fundamentally about the labor market and wages. If you look at wages, look at the average hourly earnings number we got with the last.
그러니까 그 웨이지랑 레이버 마켓을 그렇게 만들어 놓은 게 누구야?
You don't really see
그 사람을 블레임 해야지.
In terms of our average hourly earnings coming down. Now there may be composition effects and other effects in that, so we don't put too much weight on any one report. These things can be volatile month to month, but we'll be looking for wages moving, down to more normal levels where workers are doing well and ultimately their gains are not being eaten up by inflation.
예, 저도 그런 느낌이 들고 있어요. 기자회견 끝나기 전에 쇼슨 처리를 해야 될 것 같아.
Excuse me, Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. There's a little bit of a disconnect between the optimistic view you just expressed about the economy and the changes that you've made.
좀 맞가는 소리를 좀 해야 되는데.
And I'm wondering if you're reacting to the fact that the markets have loosened financial conditions, or if you feel the Fed may be a little bit behind on inflation, whether the recent disinflation we're seeing is transitory or not, and how this affects the idea of a soft landing if you're projecting just 0.5% growth for this year.
이제 contradictory 되는 말을 해야 될 거예요.
I think I got your question. So, one thing is to say is
경기는 침체라 그러면서 soft landing은 또 어떻게 될 것이냐 뭐 이제 그런 얘기를 하는 거예요.
And I think we're getting close to that level of
느낌적 느낌.
sufficiently restrictive. We laid out today what our best estimates are to get there. It boils down to how long do we think this process is going to take? And of course, we welcome these better inflation reports for the last 2 months. They're very welcome, but I think we're realistic about the broader project.
저는 차트가 말해주는 대로
That's the point I would
움직이고 있습니다.
We see goods prices coming down. We understand what will happen with housing services, but the big story will really be the rest of it, and there's not much progress there. And that's going to
그렇게 나쁘지 않아요, 내용이. 내용이 그렇게 나쁘지 않아요. 아주 논리적으로 충분히 이해를 할 수 있는 만한 내용이기 때문에
two good monthly reports are, very welcome. Of course, they're very welcome.
만약에 시장에서 피벗을 기대했다 그러면은 문제가 되지만 피벗을 기대한 게 아니기 때문에
Inflation is 6% CPI. That's 3 times our 2% target. Now, it's good to see progress, but let's just understand we have a long ways to go to get back to price stability.
계속 똑같은 얘기예요. 갈 길은 멀다. 하지만 이렇게 하고 있다.
No, I don't say that. I would say this. To the extent we need to keep rates higher and keep them there for longer, and inflation, moves up higher and higher, I think that narrows the runway. But lower inflation readings, if they persist in time, could certainly make it more possible. So I don't think anyone knows whether we're going to have a recession or not, and if we do, whether it's going to be a deep one or not. It's not knowable. And certainly
불확실성, 내년에 경기 침체에 대한 불확실성 계속 얘기하고 있죠.
would increase the likelihood of so I would put it this way, of a return to price stability that involves
일단 들어가실 때가 된 것 같네요, 이제. 저도 막 머리에서 용량 초과야 지금. 너 귀에서 피날 것 같아.
Hi, Chairman Powell. Brian Chung, NBC News. You warned Americans of pain earlier this year as the Fed hikes rates, but with the Fed now expected to raise rates higher than you thought when you first said that, just wondering where we are in that pain. How would you describe that to Americans if the projections on unemployment find themselves? That would be 1.6 million Americans out of jobs.
So the largest amount of pain, the worst pain, would come from a failure to raise rates high enough and from us allowing inflation to become entrenched in
이게 가장 큰 고통은 인플레이션을 못 잡는 거에 대한 거라 그렇게 얘기하는 것
out of
같아요.
the economy would be very high in terms of unemployment, meaning very high unemployment for extended periods of time. The kind of thing that had to happen when inflation really got out of control, and the Fed didn't respond aggressively enough or soon enough in a prior episode, 50 years ago. So that's really the worst pain would be if we failed.
지금 과거에 50년 전에 있었던 그 인플레이션 충분히 잡지 못하고서 이자 내려고 그랬을 때 그런 거를 실수 안 하려고 하는 그런 얘기를 또 하는 것 같아요. 그러니까 여러분들이 지금 모르는 얘기를 하지 않아요. 다 여지까지 유튜브에서 얘기 듣고 어디서 얘기 듣고 저한테 주소 듣고 막 그런 얘기들 다 다시 하는 거예요. 근데 중요한 거는 어디에 지금 포커스를 가지고 있느냐를 잘 보면 좋을 것 같아요.
It seems to me that we will get inflation under control, and I believe we will. We're certainly highly committed to do that.
끝날 때 되지 않았나 이제?
Mr. Chair, Grady Trimble with Fox Business. You've reiterated today, and the committee has reiterated its commitment to that 2% inflation target. I wonder, is there ever a point where you actually reevaluate that target and
좋은 질문이다.
your inflation target?
지금 인플레이션 타겟을 2%로 하는데 그거를 조금 좀 다르게 리이밸류에이트 해볼 생각 없느냐?
Our inflation goal is just something we're not thinking about. It's not something we're not going to think about. We have a 2% inflation goal, and we'll use our tools to get inflation back to 2%. I think this isn't the time to be thinking about that.
그냥 단호박. 그냥 우리는 2%다. 2% 변경할 거 생각해보지도 않았고 생각해볼 것도 아니다. 그냥 2%이다.
Under any circumstances, we're gonna
어떤 상황이라도 고려해보지 않을 것이다.
tools to get inflation back to 2%.
단호박. 귀에서 피 날라 그러네.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Nicole Goodkind, CNN Business. As you monitor wage growth and unemployment data, I wonder if you're paying close attention to a sector or even income level. Like, how do you factor potential exacerbations of inequality?
인컴 레벨에 대한 그 실업률과 레이버 웨이지에 대해 가지고 이제 그 인컴 클래스에 따라서 본 적이 있느냐 뭐 그런 얘기예요.
Labor market that we had in 2018, 19, 20. So what that looked like was wage increases for the people at the lowest end of the income spectrum were the largest. The gaps between racial groups and gender groups were at their smallest in recorded history. All of that because of a tight labor market. A tight labor market which had inflation running, just a tick below 2%, and the economy growing right at its potential. So that seems like something that would be really good for the economy and for the country if we could get back to that. And so that's what all of us want to do. We want to get back to a long expansion where the labor market can remain strong over an extended period of time. That's a really good thing for workers in the economy, and we'd love to get back to that. That's what our goal is. There's in the near term, we have to use our tools to restore price stability, but we can't. What we have to think about is the medium and longer term. If you think about it, the country went through a difficult time. I think much more difficult than we can think it would happen here, but it really set up our economy for several decades of prosperity. So price stability is something that really pays dividends for the benefit of the economy and the people.
질문과 대답이 좀 다른 것 같은데 그냥 멋있는 얘기는 했어요. 앞으로 몇십 년을 풍족하게 prosperity 그러니까 번영을 하려면은 지금 좀 고생해야 된다. 질문의 대답인지 모르겠는데.
We do. Yes, we absolutely do. We look at it's our regular practice to talk about unemployment rates by different groups, including racial groups and that sort of.
이제 질문하네. 다른 그룹별로 이렇게 해분화해서 보고 있다.
Hi, Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. What would you do if the economy slows so much that we enter a recession before we see strong, consistent signs that inflation is slowing?
오케이, 이제 좋은 질문이다 이것도. 그러니까 경기 침체가 인플레이션이 잡히기 전에 너무 심하게 나오면 어떻게 하겠느냐. 그랬더니 너무 가정이 많다. 시작하네요.
So let me just say, that we have to use our tools to support maximum employment and price
이제
stability.
똑같은 얘기하고 있어요. 아주 원칙주의자야. 그런 질문을 하니까 다분히 이렇게 너무 가정이 많은 질문인 것 같다 그러더니 지금 원칙적인 얘기하잖아요. 인플레이션 잡고 맥시멈 인플로이 만들고.
Nominal wages are very high, so the labor market is very, very strong. Where we're missing is
이제 거의 뭐 질문도 바닥이 난 것 같아요. 더 이상 뭐 질문할 게 없지.
that means we need to really focus on getting inflation under
그냥
control.
차라리 좀 유치하지만 직구 질문을 하지. S&P가 얼마 정도 레인지에 있어야지 너의 마음이 편안하겠느냐.
Play. But right now, clearly the focus has to be on getting inflation down.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Greg Robb from MarketWatch. You spoke a little bit ago. You said that the U.S. it looks like we have a structural labor shortage in the economy. Could you expand on that? Talk a little bit more about that. And really, are you talking about?
이제 질문은 좀 바닥이 난 것 같아요. 질문 뭐 활러리 질문이 없어요. 지금 뭐 약간 정치적으로 빠지고 있어요. 지금 structural labor shortage가 있는데 그런 거 뭐 이민자를 들어와야 되느냐 뭐 그런 얘기를 식으로 약간 유도를 하고 있어요.
Vacancies plus people who are actually working, and then you can take supply of labor by are you in the labor market? Are you looking for a job or have a job? And you're more than 4 million people short. We don't see, despite very high wages and an incredibly tight labor market, we don't see participation moving up, which is contrary to what we thought. So the upshot of all that is the labor market is actually it's 3.5 million people at least.
좋아. 가.
Have been based on pre-pandemic.
아주 오늘 기자회견 괜찮네요. 아주 논리적이고 원칙적인 질문들 많이 해주고 우리 제롬 파웰의 심리를 건드리는 그런 거 없고요.
So why is that? Part of it is just accelerated retirements. People dropped out and
지금 구조적인 뭐죠? 고용이 약해지는 이유가 고용이 약해지는 게 아니라 파티시페이션이 약해지는 거는 지금 early retirement도 있고 뭐 그런 얘기를 하고 있어요. 그리고 이민자가 줄어들고 있고.
I think if you ask businesses, pretty much everybody you talk to says there aren't enough people. We need more people. So I tried to identify that in a speech I gave a month ago.
이제 사람이 없다. 사람이 없어서 이렇게 되고 있다.
What to do because they gave us a job, and we need to do that job.
Jennifer.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. You say you expect growth of just 0.5% next year. Given that you've said the process of raising rates and getting inflation back under control will be painful, have you had discussions within the committee and addressed how long and or how deep of a recession you would be willing to accept?
내년에 성장이 0.5 정도로 예상하는데 지금 커미리랑 얼마나 리세션이 길지 얘기해봤느냐?
And if you look at those forecasts, those are forecasts for slow growth, for a softening labor market, by which I mean unemployment goes up, but not a great deal. And you see inflation coming down. You see rates going up a lot. You see inflation coming down. Those are those forecasts, and that's really what they show.
그래서 우리 또 제롬 파웰은 원칙적으로 말씀을 하십니다. 자기는 분기마다 데이터로 분석을 하고 이밸류에이트하는 것이다. 그래서 오늘 나온 거는 거기에 근거로 나오고 있어.
Of a recession and that kind of a recession, we make those forecasts. The staff runs, and you will see this if you look at the old Teal books, runs alternative simulations of all different kinds at every meeting, and we look at those too, and those will explore different things. But that's
완전히 질문이 조금 후졌어요. 이런 거죠. 이 주식 살까요? 올라갈까요? 내려갈까요? 이런 식의 질문이었어요. 지금 질문은.
We haven't asked ourselves that question.
Go to Jean for the last question.
Last question입니다.
Hi, Jean Young with Market News. I wanted to ask about the SEP again. If you're reaching peak rates around 5% in the first half of next year and inflation starts to decline materially, that would seem to make the real rate gradually more restrictive. Is that something that's built into the projections and into models? Is that something you would want to see?
So we do know that, of course, that's something that we know and we'd see. But as I mentioned, that, we wouldn't, I wouldn't see the committee cutting rates until we're confident that inflation is moving down in a sustained way.
이 질문도 똑같은 질문이에요. 내년 터미널 레이시 5%까지 올라가기 전에 아니면 내지는 5%를 히트했을 때 인플레이션이 significantly 내려왔을 때 이자율을 내릴 것이냐 그런 거 했더니
For cutting rates, I think in the event it'll be a question of do we actually feel confident that inflation.
그래서 지금 그 제롬 파웰이 얘기한 거는 자기가 확실한 그러니까 의회들이 확실하게 컨피던스 확신이 있지 않기 전에는 하지 않을 것이다. 뭐 괜찮았어요. 이제 중요한 건 주가죠. 주가가 털어질지 내려갈지 여기서 서포트를 받을지 그게 이제 퀘션입니다. 그렇게 악재로 나온 것 같지는 않은데
So we took a dip right when that statement came out around 2:30 and the projections, the S&P key kept
좀 끌어올려줬으면 좋겠네요. 느낌에. 그냥 오늘의 고점 정도까지만 다시 회복하면 지수들 양전하고 끝나면 좋을 것 같아요. 느낌이.
Side of the story. The
이거는 이
market
부분이고.
on that news, but it's come all the way back. At the low of the day, the Dow is down 404 points. We're positive now 3 points. Also want to show you what's happened intraday with the US dollar. This is always the best way to gauge the reaction, the litmus test really for the Fed and for the market reaction. The dollar initially rose. That was the hawkish view that we got on the higher for longer interest rate projections. But then it fell as Powell continued to talk. Falling dollar perhaps helped take stocks up with it.
야, 여기 지지해줘야 되는데.
Economic Council Director Gary Cohn. He is also the Vice Chairman now of IBM and the former President of Goldman Sachs. Back with us for his Fed tradition. It's good to have you.
Great to be here, Sarah.
피곤하다. 귀에 피 날 것 같네. 간만에 헤드폰을 끼고 한 1시간을 듣고 있으니까 귀가 피 날 것 같네. 여러분들도 대략 이해가 되셨죠? 뭐 질문은 많은 것 같은데 포인트는 그거예요. 지금 뭐 이자율 내리고 뭐 피벗을 하고 그런 건 시기상조고 그거는 연준에서 완전히 확신이 들 때 한다. 그리고 앞으로 이자율 최종 터미널 레이트는 조금 올라간 것 같다. 5%보다 조금 상방으로. 그리고 내년에는 경기는 좀 좋지 않을 것으로 예상한다. 그리고 인플레이션이 있는 부분을 세 가지로 나눠서 물건, goods, 그 다음에 real estate, 그 다음에 서비스, 레이버죠. 근데 레이버가 가장 문제다. 그 물건 같은 경우에는 이제 안정이 되는 추세이고, 그 다음에 리얼 이스테이트 같은 경우에는 내년 중반쯤 되면 안정이 될 것이다. 그리고 하지만 아주 스티키한 임금 때문에 올라가는 인플레이션은 상당히 오래 지속될 것 같다. 이제 그런 거죠. 임금은 못 내리잖아요. 그렇죠? 임금을 내리려면 어떻게 돼야 되냐면은 고용이 안 좋거나 아니면 경기가 진짜 안 좋아서 전반적으로 다 임금을 삭감해야 되는 그런 시츄에이션이 돼야지 가능한 거기 때문에 그 부분에 대해서 얘기를 했어요. 오케이. 저는 여기까지. 오늘 연준 얘기는 여기까지 하면 충분한 것 같죠? 여러분들 다 이해되셨고 제가 사이사이 가능한 한 통역을 좀 해드리려고 그랬는데 이게 들으면서 말하는 게 이게 쉽지가 않아요. 저는 다 이해가 되는데 이렇게 들으면서 들으면서 바로 단어 이렇게 정확한 단어 찾아가지고 얘기하는 게 좀 쉽지는 않은데 핵심은 그래요. 핵심은 다 그런 것들이 있었습니다.
Continues to be extremely tight. Why is this a problem for the Fed?
Well, Sarah, I'll point something out here. This
대부분 뭐 미국 거주하시는 분은 다 알아들으실 만한 내용이었으니까 혹시 한국에 계신 분들 궁금하신 거 있으면 좀 전에 제가 그렇게 핵심적으로 요약한 그 내용입니다. 오늘 전반적으로.
price of lumber. Right. We were talking about the price of gasoline. We were talking about the price of oil. We were talking about the price of shipping containers. Right. And that
그리고 진짜로 궁금하시다. 그러면 연준 사이트에 가셔가지고요. 요거 찾으셔가지고 보시면 돼요. 그리고 이것도 글이 무슨 얘기인가 모르면 구글 트랜슬레이트 딱 하셔가지고 보시면 다 나오는 거니까요. 이렇게 보시면 됩니다.
Now look,
저희가 더 중요한 거는 거죠. 연준이 무슨 얘기를 한 것도 중요하지만 이제 주가가 위로 갈 건가 아래로 갈 것인가 그거를 우리가 대응과 대비를 해야 되는 건데 그냥 제가 보는 거는 뭐 시장에서 어떻게 결정할지 모르지만 그렇게 나쁜 얘기는 아니다. 되게 논리적으로 억셉할 만한 얘기다. 그냥 시장은 막 불안해가지고 폭락하고 그런 추세는 아니고 그냥 오케이 알았어 가던 대로 갈게 뭐 이런 정도 아니면은 이렇게 쭉쭉쭉쭉 가니까 비가 오지만 뭐 가랑비 정도면 맞고 가겠어 뭐 이런 정도로 반응하지 않을까. 지금 집 나가는데 막 폭우가 칠지 가랑비가 내릴지 모르는 그런 상황이었잖아요. 근데 딱 보니까 비가 오는 거는 맞는데 나는 우산이 없어. 근데 젖긴 젖을 것 같은데 이 정도면은 그냥 젖으면서 가겠다. 이제 그런 정도의 리액션이 오지 않을까 싶어요. 일단 오늘은 이 부분, 이 서포트가 잘 유지되나가 중요해요. 이 부분에서 유지만 되어준다 그러면 나쁘진 않을 것 같아요. 왜냐하면 어제도 주가가 많이 안 올라갔잖아요. 그렇죠? 거의 뭐 되돌림하고 끝냈고 오늘도 거의 되돌림이죠. 그렇다면은 뭐예요? 굳이 내려갈 필요가 없죠. 그렇죠? 그러면은 이 정도에서 지지부진하게 행보를 하는 것도 나쁘지 않다. 그러니까 3,900에서 4,100 사이를 뭐 그렇게 과격하게 다니면 좀 심하고 한 4,000 근처에서 왔다 갔다 하면 좋을 것 같아요.
I think we're in this 3-year normalization cycle. If people are getting back to normal, it means they're going to have to go back to work. They can't just go spend money and have a good time.
여러분들 좀 이렇게 좀 반응 좀 해주세요. 200명밖에 안 계신데.
That will help us with the wage side of inflation. So I do think we're at this interesting.
그쪽 다른 데 다 가 있는 거야. 막 글 써주고 그런 대로. 저는 뭐 이렇게 직접 타입하면서 타입도 느리고 한글 타입은 그냥 못해요. 다른 사람처럼. 저는 입만 가지고 얘기하는 사람이기 때문에.
Chair Powell's news conference, and Gary and I were talking. We thought you asked a really interesting question about basically whether the Fed chair
에이미킴님
the stock market is up a lot since
감사합니다.
the last meeting as he's trying to tighten policy. I'm not sure if you were satisfied with the answer.
Never satisfied with the answer, but very satisfied that both you and Gary thought it was a good question. Look, here's the thing. The stock market, I think, is the least of Powell's problems. I think the bigger problem.
에이미킴님 감사해요. 우리 에이미킴님 제가 아시는 에이미킴님이죠?
Sarah, that the January 24, in other words, the end of the year for next year, is now trading in that 436 area right now, which is, remember, the Fed is at 5.15 for year end. So there's a big gap there. There's going to be some kind of conflict. Let's hear how Powell answered the question about whether or not this loosening of financial conditions represents a problem for him.
I would say it's our judgment today that we're not at a sufficiently restrictive policy stance yet, which is why we say that we would expect that ongoing hikes would be appropriate.
그렇죠. 어제 이게 좀 내려가더라도 그렇게 심하게 막 엄청나게 내려가거나 그러지는 않을 거예요. 근데 이제 여러분들이 이제 조심하셔야 될 게 이번 금요일이 세마녀의 날이에요. 그래가지고 그거에 대한 변동성이 또 생기지 않을까 싶기도 해요. 그 변동성을 우리가 어떻게 대비해야 될지는 모르겠네요. 지금 요 정도니까 제가 보는 거는 요 레인지 사이로 보면은 388에서 410이잖아요. 이 레인지에서 좀 움직임이 있을 것 같아요. 아이디얼리 보면은 3920 정도면은 지금 150일 이동평균선 위거든요. 그러면은 150일 이동평균선 위에면 추세 위에요, 추세. 그러니까 추세선에서 위에만 있으면 결국은 지금 베어리시에서 불리시로 이렇게 옮겨갈 수 있는 긍정적인 주가의 흐름은 볼 수 있어요. 경기 침체가 와도 주가는 올라가요. 그건 아시죠? 오늘
it's an interesting debate, but the market's been more right over the
네, 끝.
recent years or so.
됐어요. 오늘 요것만 쳐다보고 있으면 될 것
The
같아요.
obvious, we could look at where the dot plot was a year ago as we sat here.
테슬라는 157.5,
The dot plot wasn't any
S&P는 4,000,
sat here. So if you ask
나스닥은 모르겠어요. 나스닥 컴포짓 해봐야 되는지.
much more accurate,
근데 좀 떨어질 것 같네. 좀 또 차트 흐름이.
people are going to be forced back into the labor force. And we're going to get wages to settle down to some degree.
So Gary,
얘는 270, 280 깨지네 또. 흘러내리네.
that's what has to happen for the market to
기분 나쁘게 흘러내리네.
That's what has to happen.
여기서만 받아줘도 괜찮아요.
That we could get rate cuts at the end of the year. It is possible if we get workforce participation back to where I think we may see it. We'll get participation back, and unfortunately, we'll get participation back at a time
급하게 질문 한번 해볼까?
jobs slowing down as well, which means we will get higher and higher unemployment, which would then lead you to a rate cut towards the end of the year.
Steve Leisman. Steve, thank you very much. We appreciate it. It sounds like, Gary, you are leaning more into the pause camp.
I guess you would call it a pause. I've always been in the soft landing camp. Soft landing, back.
You still see a soft landing, not recession?
You know, I think it's soft landing.
좀 아슬아슬하기는 해요. 라버트님도 감사드립니다. 그리고 또 누구야? 은미님, 홍은미님 감사드립니다. 여러분들은 어때요? 지금 현재 주가 유지해줄 것 같아요? 아니면 빠질 것 같아요? 이게 이제 가장 큰 포인트일 것 같아요. 오늘. 상당히 애매한 위치가 있네요. 애매한 위치. 지금 테크니컬로 보면은 조금 빠질 것 같은데 이 매수대만 있으면은 올라가거든요. 지금 이 매수대에서 좀 받아주면 여러분같이 긍정적으로 저같이 긍정적으로 이해한 사람들이 많다면 받아줄 텐데 그렇지 않다면은 이제 이것도 아니야 싶어서 눌러버릴 수도 있을 것 같아요. 수님 감사합니다. 저는 한국에 사시는 줄 알았더니 미국에 사시는구나 우리 수님. 아슬아슬해요 여기가. 마음 같아서는 좀 버텨줬으면 하는데 왜 이렇게 나쁘진 않았는데 볼륨이 없어. 모멘텀. 지켜보자 우리. 지켜보자.
They can only diverge so long. And at the end of the day, the Fed controls the front end, as you and I have talked about. They've got some immediate reaction into some financial impact into the consumer. But at the end of the day, the market's going to control what's going on because corporate debt and other borrowings.
아직까지는 전저점이 깨지지 않았게 괜찮은데 너무 내려오면 그 다음부터 추세 떨어지면은 하락으로 가야 될 것 같아요.
When he got asked by one of the reporters if they would consider revising their inflation target, their goal higher, and he said like 5 different ways, nope, not even thinking about it. It's not something we would consider under no circumstance. And then he said there might be a longer run project about looking at the 2% inflation target. What do we make of that? Because it is going to be hard to get back to 2%, isn't it? They don't expect it till, I don't know, 2025 or whatever the plot says.
Yeah, look, I agree it's a long-run project to get back to 2%. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to get back to 2%. But I also agree with the way the chairman answered.
내가 너를 사랑하는 것이 죄일까?
In the Powell Fed, we will
너를 믿는 것이 죄일까?
off the 2% target rate.
For credibility's sake, he has to stay there.
For credibility's sake. And for the Fed to move.
하락 볼륨이 좀 나오네.
That's something they have to take very seriously. They would have to talk about it for a long period of time. They would have to study it. And it's not something they could do very often. If they started moving their targets for inflation around, they would lose credibility very quickly with the market. We're going to adjust our inflation target based on what we see going on in the economy. that would really inhibit the credibility of what the Fed does. The Fed needs to have a
헤드앤숄더가 돼버리나?
and they need to live with them through thick and thin.
So ultimately, what it sounds like to me, your reaction, and this
헤드앤숄더가 돼도 여기가 넥라인이면 넥라인에서
was last time, right? A little bit.
Definitely less hawkish than last time.
Yeah.
Definitely less
So if
hawkish
he's
than
less
last time.
hawkish, and they're nearing the end of the hiking, and you think there's a soft landing, do you buy stocks?
Again, overall, I think I do, but I think, as I say many times, I think you have to look at companies and company specifics. I do agree that this sort of spending spree that has been going on for the last couple of years with people having stimulus money and people being able to spend, that's going to come out of the economy. So some companies that have been affected by that are clearly going to have different earnings potential going forward. So I think you have to analyze the companies and analyze their competitive situation and how they're going to be affected by what I would call
김치님 감사합니다.
normalized economic picture in the United States.
제가 여러분이랑 쉐어할 거는 이제 다 됐어요. 그러니까 뭐 한 30분 남았으니까 종료하지는 않고 그냥 이렇게 화면만 쉐어하고 있을게요. 제가 이렇게 떠들고 그럴 거는 없을 것 같습니다. 여기서 슬레이트를 한번 딱 쳐야죠.
What is that ultimately going to mean for next year? Why don't they just pause now and see how it shakes out?
Look, I do believe there's a little bit of truth in that. I've said numerous times that the Fed was late to this game.
함께 해주시고 시청해 주셔서 감사합니다.
Staying longer doesn't necessarily fix the problem. I think they need to take a
일단 화면만 공유하고 있을게요.
objective view of where we are. Even in the statement, I pointed
혹시 뭐 질문하실 거 있으면 질문하셔도 되고
higher food and energy prices.
1시까지는 이렇게 틀어놓고 있겠습니다.
Prices on the spot market. We do at the retail level. I will clearly say at the retail level. We do have them at the retail level. We know that housing, we know that rents in big cities are coming down. You have plenty of the big real estate companies on. You have plenty of the big real estate owners on. They tell you that rents are coming down.
City.
Yeah, we tell you that rents are coming down. We know that rents a lag in the calculation. So we know that these effects are coming through the economy. So look, I do think in some respects, in the couple of questions where the chairman was asked today, he gave a mild hint that we are slowing down. And we are 60 basis points away from our terminal rate. And we won't meet till February again. And February could be 25. And if we've gone from 75, 50, 25, that to me is a pretty dramatic slowdown.
And then after that, done?
Maybe another 25, maybe not. But by then you will have almost another quarter of data.
Right. And a lot can change.
A lot can change.
All right, Gary, don't go anywhere. Just want to show everybody what's happening. We're taking another leg lower here in the market, down more than 200 points right now on the Dow. The S&P 500 is down about 0.75%. All the sectors just went negative. Consumer staples and healthcare were holding up. They just went down on the day. The worst hit group right now are the financials. The banks are getting hit. The materials, real estate, some of the cyclical groups, again, on this Fed news. Technology is also lower with the NASDAQ down 1%. It's still up about 1.3% so far for the week. Up next, we will get the White House's take on the Fed's decision in a first on CNBC interview with National Economic Council Director Brian Deese. Remember that job?
Yes,
he used to do it. Also, Double Lines, Jeffrey Gundlach weighing in on the Fed and the impact on the bond market coming up at the top of the hour on Overtime. Stay with us here on CNBC, down 255.
게임 오버일까요? 시간이 너무 없다. 지금 임금 고용에서 나오는 인플레이션이 커요. 그 문제가 그게 심각하기 때문에 오늘 그냥 0% 정도만 만들어주면 참 좋을 것 같은데 그러기에는 시간이 너무 없네. 22분. 하나, 둘, 셋, 넷, 다, 여, 일곱, 여덟, 아홉, 열. 가능할 수도 있는데.
Fed day afternoon. Here is what the market reaction is. The S&P 500 is down 0.75%. Nasdaq's falling now 1%. We're starting to move south again. Again, we've been all over the map. The low of the day was down 400 on the Dow right after that. That statement was released by the Federal Reserve. They raised interest rates 50 basis points as expected, but the signal from the statement and the news conference was higher for longer. There's more work to do when it comes to fighting inflation and more evidence that the Fed needs to see that inflation is really coming down meaningfully. But Chair Powell didn't rule out 25 basis points, another step down in the increase in rates at the next February meeting. There's a lot there. The result is we're seeing lower Treasury yield, so bonds are getting a bid. The dollar's a little bit weaker, and stocks are again turning lower. Nasdaq now down more than 1%. Joining us now is the National Economic Council Director, Brian Deese from the White House. It's good to have you, Director Deese. Welcome.
It's good to see you.
So I know we're going to talk about inflation clearly, and I know you want to keep the Fed a little bit separate, but do you sort of wish that the Fed, I don't know, might take a pause as we see inflation numbers coming down and the impact starting to damage the economy?
Well, you're right. I'm going to leave the Fed's decision-making and the communication that they made today alone for the reason that we don't comment directly on their policy. What I would say is if you look at the macroeconomic context over the course of the last couple of months, I think what we're seeing is continued progress and continued resilience toward what the president has been talking about now for months of this transition toward more stable and steady growth. And I think that that's what we all want to see. And we are seeing some meaningful progress on that front. Resilient consumer, resilient labor market, and now a couple months in a row of inflation showing positive developments in terms of cooling. There's more to do, but certainly we're seeing progress.
Right. And so the Fed chair himself said that there's a lag to monetary policy, as we all know. What are your expectations as a White House economist about what the lagged impacts are going to be on the economy of these higher interest rates?
Well, look, certainly the monetary tightening cycle operates differently across different sectors of the economy. Certainly housing is one place where we have seen a pronounced impact. And one of the things that's interesting about the inflation data that we saw come out yesterday is that we're seeing a sort of a peaking of the printed inflation data on housing at very high levels. But what we know in terms of real-time data in the market is that market rents and housing prices have started to turn over. And so, what you need to do is balance what the data is showing, but what we try to focus on mostly is what's happening out there in the economy. What are people experiencing? What are businesses experiencing? What are households experiencing? And so certainly you got to navigate those lags. They operate differently in different contexts. But, one thing I will say practically speaking is that households and businesses over the course of the last 8 weeks, 10 weeks, have been experiencing significant declines in energy costs. That's true at the pump for households, down about $1.70 since the summer. It's also true for businesses. We've seen meaningfully declines in the cost of diesel, for example. And so those are, again, some promising signs, but also things that we know are happening real time in the economy right now.
Where does inflation go next year?
Well, look, we're going to be careful about and cautious about trying to predict the future. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, uncertainty globally, and we need to factor that in. And as the president said yesterday, we have more work to do to see inflation come down. But what I would say is that the signs we are seeing now are promising, promising across goods, promising across services outside of the housing sector. And as I said on housing, there's reason to believe that in the actual market environment, we're seeing progress as well. So I think the outlook right now, I think, is progress and more optimism, cautious optimism that we are seeing movement.
문 닫도록 하겠습니다. 아무런 반응이 없으시니까.
But we have a ways to go here. We have to keep our
감사합니다.
on the policy side. We need to continue to focus on things that can help to lower costs for American families, lower costs for American businesses. The good news on that front is a number of the provisions that we enacted this summer are slated to